Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my July 2026 reading wrap-up video. I'm getting this out a couple of days later than I hoped, of course, because I was late on finishing some books. My MO is that I count all the books that I start in the previous month as that month's reading. But anyway, I'm here now. We're going to keep going forward. I've actually talked about a lot of these books in previous Am Reading videos. Maybe I'll keep it short and sweet, although I do tend to ramble. So let's get into it. So the first book I read last month is Winter Kept Us Warm by Raeff. This was one of my top of the Goodreads books. I have a resolution every year to basically clear the top of my Goodreads TBR, the books that have been on the list for the longest. And this is a book about three people predominantly and the lives they lead after a particular winter that they spend together. Leo and Isaac were both American soldiers during World War II, and Yuli was a German citizen. And Leo and Isaac end up in Germany for post-war, reconstruction, and they meet Yuli at a bar and actually end up spending a lot of the first winter after World War II in an abandoned apartment with her. And it just sort of inculcated something, like after all of the trauma of the war and everything that they suffered, this was sort of like a safe space for them. And the three of them got into a bit of a relationship together. Things get a little hairy. There's some queerness, but mostly Leo, who actually, is gay, or, slowly realizing that about himself, gets together romantically with Yuli, and ultimately the two of them do repatriate back to the States and have children. And then both of them end up leaving the family and the marriage, and it's Isaac who takes care of the kids ultimately. There is a bunch of ultimately, moving into further and further decades in this book, and it jumps around. The timeline's not chronological. And we get to see, who these people turn into. There's a lot of ennui, I found, a lot of sort of philosophical, who am I, what makes me happy sort of things that I think in a way, even for me and my pro-plotless self, it got to be a bit much after a while, but I largely enjoyed it while reading the book. There is also a little bit of Jewish content. Isaac is of Jewish descent. His parents were Russian immigrants, socialists, although they're now out of step with the USSR, and he's not identified much as Jewish, although sometimes, it comes up in his storyline. So yeah, I thought for funsies to do something a little bit different, I'd compare some of these first books I'll talk about a little bit to a recent experience I had in watching the Interview with the Vampire TV adaptation. I did that very recently in July, and then I just finished watching the Vampire Lestat adaptation concurrently with when it was airing on AMC. And I bring that up, well, with this book in particular, with Interview with the Vampire, the adaptation changed the timelines of that story. The timelines of that story and following those characters are mostly in the 18th and 19th century for the most part. But in this one, there's a lot of it that takes place during World War II and even in the immediate post-war era in Paris. And it made me think, because this whole Winter That Kept Us Warm was supposed to be this inculcating event, this idea of that they had this safe space to sort of become human and test these relationships with each other after the traumas that they faced. Yuli was there in Germany during the Russian invasion. Isaac and Leo worked at a prisoner of war camp in America, and there were some harrowing experiences even there. And so, World War II for so many people, was just so upending and jarring. I mean, it's strange to think, I feel like the idea of vampires in the Anne Rice world is that they're the ones who are sort of jarred out of time and space because they live forever. But it's interesting that in the adaptation, they spent part of it in World War II where the humans were also the same way. And so we have this scene, an Interview with a Vampire, where one of the vampires, Claudia, wants to turn another person, Madeline, into a vampire. And another one of the vampires, Armand, asks Madeline, how will you cope with, eternity after, your era is gone? And she says, you think there's something left of my era, because she had just lived through World War II in Paris and, talked about some of the harrowing things she saw. So I felt like that was interesting, and it's just a reminder of that piece of history and just how upending it was. Next, I'll talk about Berlin Atomized by Julia Kornberg, translated, I think from the Spanish it was, by Jack Rockwell and Julia Kornberg. I used this as my Buzzwordathon pick for July. In all honesty, I did not get on with this book very much. I think the idea was, we're following these sort of well-to-do, rich and spoiled teenagers to young adults who grew up in Argentina but then go world trotting during like close to the modern age and into the near future when a sort of dystopian events start to happen. And, we're primarily following these siblings. They're part of a Jewish family. We have a sister, Nina. We have two brothers. One brother ends up going to Gaza. I think this was written before October 7th. But anyway, he does go to Gaza and he dies there. And that's, in one of the vignettes of this story, that's a big deal. And then we jump around to other things and events. And for the most part, it just didn't stick with me. I wasn't invested in the story and the characterization. There are some things that kind of stood out less and less as I get, some distance from this book. But one of it is, we are in this sort of dystopian future for the last couple of chapters, and Nina is living in Paris, and she's in this band, and I believe Paris has been hit by a bunch of sort of guerrilla and sectarian violence. And I was watching The Vampire Lestat around the same time. I think I even mentioned it in the AM reading video, which felt kind of similar because Lestat, technically a Parisian vampire, although mostly centered in Montreal now, he was in a band. And they were teasing the fact of this post-apocalyptic future because Lestat was waking up the vampire queen Akasha and teasing throughout the season that, bad shit was going to follow. And we didn't see any of it, much of it in The Vampire Lestat. I think it's going to come up in the next season, sort of, the destruction of cities and what have you. But I was thinking a lot about that when reading particular parts of this book. And maybe I was projecting things into this book that weren't even there because of that, connection. Yeah, I tried with this one, but it didn't really work for me. Next, I read as a 2026 anticipated release, When We See You Again. It's a memoir by Rachel Goldberg-Polin. Goldberg-Polin is not a traditional writer or memoirist, but she was made infamous due to her son Hirsch, who was taken by Hamas during October 7th as one of the hostages and then murdered after several months in captivity. And so this is her accounting of sorts. It does go into some of what she was going through, just historically in the events that she did to, advocate for the hostages. And she was one of the most preeminent advocates, in part because she does live in, Jerusalem, but she also is an American citizen, and she probably had some of the best English skill, and just in general, you can tell from what she says in speeches and what she wrote here, she's a deeply thoughtful person, but this was a lot more disjointed. I suppose it shouldn't have surprised me as much as it did, because a lot of it has to do with the grief, and the grief is going nowhere. And in a weird way, there's a connection to The Vampire Lestat in this, or into both, because there's a storyline in The Vampire Lestat about, the two main vampires, Louis and Lestat, lost their daughter, Claudia, to violence, and they are able to hold like this seance to talk to her, and it doesn't go well, and there isn't this happy ending about, finding peace after all of that. And that's, in a lot of this book, that's what it's about. Rachel Goldberg-Polin has found no peace. She is still physically, mentally, and emotionally struggling with this just, upending reality of the death of her son and how to live the rest of her life without him. So there's just this unsettlingness about, the lack of closure and the lack of comfort, that is a part of actual reality that in the Vampire Lestat is a fictional story, but it was trying to parse that, and then Rachel Goldberg-Polin was trying to parse it in her reality about what she is going through. So this was a really moving book for me, but I did talk about in my, previous videos that I feel like I need more time to sit with it. I'm kind of hoping that my Synagogue's Israel book club might pick it up next season, although I'm not sure if they will. I could reach out and ask about that, I suppose, and I'm just hoping, this is something I think would benefit talking with a group about this book as well. So I probably will be returning to it sometime in the future. With that, I think my interview with Vampire Lestat interlude is over, and now I'll get into a short stories interlude. I'm not showing you, but I actually read a bunch of short stories last month. I do read one per am reading video regularly from a literary journal, so I was doing that. I also have a try a story tag video. I'll link down below, and I'm just slowly making my way through a couple of collections there. Plus, in my cruise reading video, I did a whole section of reading a couple of stories in a new collection of books, which I guess I could take off from there. Yeah, I didn't finish it. I'm just slowly trying to read some short stories, as sort of ongoing projects on this channel, year-long projects. But I did finish one short story collection, AERIE, by Lee-Ann Liles, although technically these aren't short stories, these are essays. And so these are indie, this is an indie publication, self-published, and I picked it for my page 112 tag last month, although I kind of cooked the books a little bit. I didn't quite play the game like I usually do, because I wanted to read this last month before I went on my next Bermuda trip, which I also did last month, because this is a Bermudan author. I picked her up in a bookstore last year in Bermuda. And so I have a whole video that I'll link down below where I talk about these essays where she chronicles aspects of her life, like her writing life, part of her life that she actually spent in Baltimore, which is where I was born, and she talks a little bit about her family and about her career, and so there's some interesting stuff in there, and I'll link to the video again down below. Next, speaking of the cruise, I read this book on my cruise. This is All the World Can Hold by Jung, which was one of my 2026 anticipated releases, and excitingly enough for me, takes place on a cruise ship to Bermuda. So it was a lot of fun to read this on a cruise ship to Bermuda and, pick a little bit at, the aspects of cruise life that Jung decided to highlight as I was sort of, living that lifestyle myself, like the types of entertainment and the dining and the staff and, the pool and the contours of the ship and what have you. That was pretty fun. But otherwise, there's a lot about this story that's very different than mine, because this one actually takes place immediately after 9/11, and I think it's based on Jung Yun's personal experience that she took a cruise around that time as well. And it's just such a surreal experience for that to happen. But, all of these people had booked their tickets beforehand and decided for various reasons to stick with it, even though, their port of exit had to change from New York to Boston because of 9/11. And it's also a reminder, one of those things maybe you forget after 20 years and 25 years is that, things didn't, clear up all that easily. It's not like a one and done event. 9/11 had huge amounts of repercussions, and for months afterwards they were still cleaning up messes and looking for missing people and trying to figure out exactly what happened. So this is still a very reeling time of uncertainty, and we are following various characters with various associations with it. Our three main characters in this book, one of them is named Franny, and she's a Korean-American woman who actually worked as a lawyer in the financial district and has memories of being in the area when the attacks happened. The second character is Doug, who is this aging has-been actor who actually filmed a Love Boat style TV show on this particular cruise ship. And the final character we're following is Lucy. She's a recently graduated IT student who is very aggressively job hunting, and one of her recent interviews, or upcoming interviews actually, is with this, startup company called Google. Anyway, we're following them and their journeys on this week on the cruise ship. There are some interstitial chapters, very briefly, mostly in Bermuda and Boston, to kind of give a broader feel about, how the collective is dealing with, this harrowing tragedy of 9/11 and the aftermath, the long aftermath. There's an epilogue that goes into much more of the future in vague, broad terms. I liked aspects of this book, but I struggled a bit with some of the characterization and the storylines in part because we're squeezing them into this 1 week and we have 3 POV characters. It's a lot of exposition and not a lot of depth in the character work. And I thought that some of the secondary characters came off as particularly shallow, and it was very unsurprising from the beginning how these antagonistic characters would be framed. As just being, selfish and cruel, and there just wasn't much more to them. And so I just didn't feel like it was a fully developed sense of characterization and storylines in here for the individuals. And I don't know if she could have avoided that. Maybe it's just not worth it to, have 3 storylines crammed into a week with all of this broader, worldwide stuff happening as well. So, but I was still disappointed because I really liked her first book, but this is her 3rd that I've read and I didn't get along as well with it. On audiobook, also on the cruise, I listened to The Kingdom of Almonds by Ariel Kaplan. This is actually the 3rd and I believe final fantasy book in her Mirror Realm Cycle series. I always get some of those words mixed up, but it's a portal fantasy book that takes place during the Inquisition, although our real world counterpart is actually a fantasy secondary world in and of itself as well. But we follow some Jewish characters who, after their expulsion from Spain, walk through this portal into the magic world of Mosix, which are very Kabbalistic concepts. So we're immediately out of my realm, of my depth when it comes to a lot of the Jewish content in this book. It's just more fantastical than I'm used to, but it's a lot of fun. We are in the 3rd book of the series, and so I guess it's hard to, give a bit of a overview, but basically our main character, Tova, she was an outsider in her, mortal world, in part because she finds out that she was half Mosix. And she ends up getting embroiled in a lot of Mosix politics with a academic character called Osmel, and his nephew Barcelay, who's actually the heir to this drowned kingdom, which definitely comes back in the preceding books and has to be, addressed in this final book about his destiny. Toba comes through with her grandmother, who is this spirited figure, and also a character, Naphtali, who's her contemporary, who also ends up to have Mosix blood and has prophetic dreams. And then there's this old woman character. So we have 2 older women characters who sort of spar with each other, and it's a bit of fun. And in this book, we find out at the very end who she is, and she has a biblical identity, which is much better well known to me and from my knowledge of the Bible. It's an enjoyable read for people who really like really inventive magic systems, and there's just a lot of stuff that I don't think in terms of Buchu clones and morphing into animals and crazy sibling relationships. We have an antagonist who's Toba's sister and her father, who are kind of trying to make an empire for themselves in the magic world, which will then have impact in the mortal world because they're connected in this universe. So I think there's a lot of creative goodness in this that I think a lot of fantasy fans would enjoy this series, and I definitely enjoyed the series. Moving into books I haven't talked about yet, on Audible I also listened to Spinning at the Edges by Elizabeth Poliner as another one of my anticipated 2026 releases. Several years, over a decade ago at this point, I actually took some writing classes with Elizabeth Poliner, and I bought her first novel, which is even signed and way up there on one of those shelves you can't see, and this is her second novel. And it is historical fiction, basically, or certainly has historical fiction elements. We're following various characters who are connected largely through proximity to one another. There is some Jewish content from the Holocaust in that some of our characters are Ruth, who was once known as Rudy, and lived with her family in Amsterdam. And all of the chapters start with proclamations that were doled out to the Amsterdam Jews during the reign of the Nazis, as their rights were slowly being taken away from them. And Ruti and her parents and her sister Sophia are living through this time until her sister dies in a violent anti-Semitic attack, and then the three of them are able to escape outward and live in America, where Ruti's daughter Stephanie is born. Stephanie, we mostly see, the rest of the characters we mostly see right after the Bush and Gore election, and a lot of the tension at the time of the story is about the election results and, the Florida count, which was, such a contentious deal, and, all of the legalese about how the votes would be counted and what it would mean for the future of the country. So Stephanie is working in D.C., which was fun because Poliner put in a lot of details about landmarks that I know, because I am in this area as well. But she's also emotionally going through the loss of a friendship and the loss of a long-term romantic relationship during this time. And her mother is going through this sense of unease or crisis even, because she lives in this small town with a view of a lake, and her neighbor is building an addition to his house, and it's obstructing her view of the lake. And, it's one of those things where, rationally, with some distance, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but for her, this is a centering thing that she helps cope with her trauma of being a survivor, especially because her sister was a big fan of this lake that near their home in Amsterdam. And the spinning at the edges has to do with the fact of her sister and other characters in the US as well using the lake as the idea as sort of like, trying to tempt fate a bit during a time of personal crisis. And this leans into another set of characters in this story, Ian Lima, who is a 16-year-old boy during this time who is coming to terms with the fact that he's gay and has a crush on someone who he's in a ballet company with. And he is ultimately bitterly rejected, and Ruth and another character, a judge, Arthur, are in the right place at the right time and are able to save him from the waters. So it's one of those things where, it's a character-driven work. You get to know the characters through these sort of chapters that, stream back and forth in their lives. And I really, I liked the characterization, and the writing I thought was strong, but I do think, sort of the jumping around a bit left it a little untethered as well. And the final book I'm going to talk about here that I just recently finished is a biography of Mordecai M. Kaplan. Restless Soul is the subtitle, by Jenna, Wiessman, Joselit, which is another of my 2026 anticipated reads. I'm definitely trying to get through them because I got a lot of anticipated reads this year. But anyway, Mordecai Kaplan was the founder of the Jewish denomination I grew up in, Reconstructionism. So I was very excited to read this book, and ultimately humbled, because I feel like I really didn't know as much about this man or my own movement as I thought I did. In all honesty, I wasn't a scholar. I was growing up in a particular synagogue, and I feel like in large part my education was more or less on par with a lot of progressive Jewish American education of my day, and it wasn't quite that different from many other groups. There are some differences that I can notice, especially as an adult. I'm part of a conservative synagogue. That would be the movement of conservatism in Judaism, not the political movement. And we do prayers a little bit differently, because Kaplan was very invested in changing things up a bit. He did not like how parochial Judaism had become, and he wanted it to be a very intentional religion. So, you know, he was starting, you know, groups. Like he started a Jewish center, which ultimately morphed into a Jewish community center. Well, although I think he left before it became what it is today. Because he was often unhappy with the people around him and how, you know, his ideas for the future of Judaism really clashed against theirs. And he was in this tug of war between, you know, the Reform Jews who were not at all, you know, invested in tradition or in the, you know, the community enough for him, and the Orthodox whose views were way too parochial. And in general, this meant that most Jewish practice was just this thing that you did without really caring about it or understanding it that much. And he really resisted that and wanted to create a movement, although really I think he wanted it to be sort of like a sub-movement that could fit into broader U.S. movements, or maybe be post-denominational. Yeah, maybe he didn't even like the idea of denominations, and sort of be more of a, I don't know, a freestyling understanding. Anyway, but he was a difficult man. You know, he lived a long life. He lived for 102 years. He died the year I was born. He was in part excommunicated by the Orthodox because they were so, you know, affronted by his scholarly work and how he was, he challenged a lot of things, and a lot of things, you know, when he started synagogues and community groups, really, and he really wanted to get rid of some very integral parts of Jewish practice that he thought, you know, were too superstitious, and that, you know, we didn't, you know, think deeply enough about, and they were holding us back. But, you know, he came across the reality that a lot of people still do view Judaism as a spiritual practice, that you don't always have to rationalize everything. And that was like a major sort of push and pull, because he was a very rational man, and he had a lot of abstract ideas that he tried to get across to people, and it often didn't work. I think he had a life that was very challenging in terms of how he wanted to speak and communicate with people, and that there was some pushback, but people also flocked to him, I think, feeling maybe like there was something missing in the American Judaism of the day that he was trying to fill, to make it something that was a living, breathing thing. He, you know, conceptualized the idea of Judaism as a civilization, as something that grows with time, and then he ultimately liked the idea of peoplehood, Jewish peoplehood. He also interacted a lot with the ideas of Zionism and the growth of the Jewish state, you know, because he got to see all of that. And he also lived in Israel for a while, which also humbled me. I did not realize that, because I have this memory of 20 years ago of talking to an Israeli at a Jewish summer camp I went to, and I'm like, you know, you wouldn't know anything about Reconstructionism. He's like, yeah, of course, there's Reconstructionists in Israel. Anyway, so, you know, I'm humbled myself and remind myself of how much more I need to learn about my own history, such as it is. I mean, because he was a founder of something that I was a part of. There was also a fascinating relationship in here with him and a preeminent rabbi of the American conservative movement of that age, Abraham Joshua Heschel. I actually was reading this at my synagogue, and you know, immediately somebody brought up, has it gotten to the frenemy relationship between Kaplan and Heschel yet? And I hadn't gotten there, but then I got there, and I don't know, I probably would be more with Heschel myself, because he was more spiritual, and Kaplan was this a little more of a rigid rationalist, although he himself also, you know, struggled and changed himself and changed his religious habits as he went along, and was not consistent, although it seemed like he was striving for that. But I respect that for somebody who really wanted to seriously engage with his practice, you know, he was seriously engaging and changing things up when he felt like he should. So yeah, I'm really grateful for this. Maybe one day I will read his sprawling book, Judaism of a Civilization, that, you know, the page count always intimidates me, but I should read it anyway. But this was a great way to get a little more insight into him. And that about covers it for me now. I did also write a personal review of Interview with a Vampire, the adaptation, so I'll link that down below, since I've mentioned that a little bit in this video, along with my booktube video about more in detail about the essays that I've read from Bermuda. Expect me back on this channel within the next couple of days with my page 112 tag. It's the monthly TBR game I play, and in fact I have already filmed it because I do get so excited about it, so stay tuned for that. I'm hoping to get back on track a little bit. I feel like I've gotten a little bit off track, although not as much as I have in previous years with my BookTube schedule, but there is a lot going on, especially as I am reading for the BookTube Prize for the next couple of months, but still there's, the National Book Festival is coming up this month, and I have plenty of other reading I want to do, exciting things ahead that I hope to share with you. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.